The night it all erupted began with the sound of fists hitting flesh, a sickening thud that made every porch light flicker on. I rushed outside to see my neighbor, Thomas, a gentle man with a slow way of speaking and the kind of smile that disarmed anyone who bothered to look past his quiet demeanor. He wasn't hurting anyone, never did. Yet there he was, doubled over on the pavement, clutching his stomach as two men in cheap tactical vests loomed over him. Their fists were cocked back for another strike, their eyes cold with the arrogance of people who thought they were untouchable. And behind them, like a bloated queen bee orchestrating her swarm, stood Karen, the HOA president, her arms folded across her chest, her voice booming with mock authority. "Teach him a lesson," she barked. "Maybe then he'll understand what happens when you break HOA rules." My blood froze. Thomas had been fined endlessly for ridiculous things: grass height, his old pickup, even for feeding stray cats. He was different, slower to process things, and Karen thrived on that, turning his gentleness into her playground for cruelty. But this wasn't fines or harassment. This was violence. Neighbors began to gather, their phones out, some shouting for Karen to stop. She only raised her chin higher, her double chins quivering with self-importance. "Record all you want," she sneered. "He's a nuisance, and nuisances get dealt with." Just when it seemed Thomas might not get up again, another figure stepped into the circle of light. At first, he looked like just another neighbor rushing in, but the way he moved silenced the crowd. He had the presence of a man who had seen combat, who had carried both command and consequence on his shoulders. This was David Marshall, a retired Navy commander who had kept to himself since moving in 6 months prior. Most people only knew him as the quiet man with a service dog and a scar down his jaw. Few knew his history, and none expected to see it revealed under the streetlights that night. "Step away from him." David's voice cut through the chaos, low and sharp. The two thugs hesitated, glancing back at Karen. She waved her hand dismissively. "He's nobody," she said. "He's just another homeowner. Finish it." But in the next second, David closed the distance with precision so swift it stole everyone's breath. One thug swung at him, but David caught the wrist midair, twisting it until a bone snapped like dry wood. The man howled, crumpling to the ground. The second thug charged, but David pivoted, driving his elbow into the man's ribs with enough force to send him sprawling, gasping for air like a fish on land. The crowd erupted in gasps and shouts, phones shaking as they tried to capture what looked more like a scene from a war movie than a suburban neighborhood. Karen's smugness melted into disbelief, her eyes bulging, her mouth opening and closing like she couldn't comprehend what had just happened. You can't do that. This is HOA enforcement. You'll pay for this," she screeched. But her voice cracked, and the authority she had clung to for years crumbled in that moment. David knelt by Thomas, his voice gentler now. "You're safe. Stay with me." Then he stood again, facing Karen, his shoulders squared, his gaze steady. "I commanded men in places you can't even pronounce," he said, his voice loud enough for every neighbor to hear. "And you think your little band of thugs scares me? You've terrorized this community long enough. Tonight, it ends." The crowd roared with approval, their fear finally dissolving into anger. Neighbors shouted their grievances about Karen's fake fines, her threats, her bullying. Someone yelled, "She tried to steal my deed." Another cried, "She made me pay cash just to park in my own driveway." Every word was another stone in the wall closing in on her. Karen stumbled back, her power unraveling as quickly as her words. But she wasn't finished yet. She pulled out her phone, dialing 911 with shaking hands. "Hello? Yes, send officers immediately," she cried, her voice dripping with false terror. "There's a dangerous man attacking people. He's unstable. He's a threat to the whole neighborhood." Her performance would have been convincing if dozens of neighbors weren't recording the truth with their phones. And just as her words echoed into the night, the wail of sirens pierced the air, flashing lights racing down the street. Karen smirked again, her false confidence returning. "Now you're done," she hissed at David. "Cops always believe me. You'll be in cuffs before the night is over." But Karen had no idea the officers pulling up weren't just responding to her call. They had been monitoring her for weeks after multiple complaints of harassment and fraud. And one of them, stepping out of the cruiser with a knowing smile, had once served under David Marshall in the Navy. The sirens screamed to a stop, red and blue lights dancing against the trees and houses as the officers piled out. Karen's swollen face twisted into a victorious smirk. "That's him," she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at Commander David Marshall. "He's unstable. He broke their bones. He's a violent threat. Arrest him right now before he hurts anyone else." She thought she had won, the same way she always won by being the loudest in the room and weaving lies faster than anyone could challenge them. But then Officer Ramirez stepped forward, his boots crunching gravel, and froze when his eyes locked on David. For a moment the chaos went still. Recognition dawned, and Ramirez saluted instinctively before catching himself. "Commander Marshall," he said firmly, though there was a note of respect only someone who had served under him would carry. Murmurs erupted in the crowd. Karen blinked, her mouth gaping like a fish. "Commander," she spat. "He's no commander's a thug, just like that idiot on the ground." She gestured toward Thomas, still clutching his ribs but struggling to sit upright, supported by neighbors. Ramirez's expression hardened. "No, ma'am. He was my commanding officer overseas. He's a decorated Navy commander with commendations for valor. And judging by what I see here, he hasn't changed one bit." Gasps spread through the crowd. Phones raised higher now, people whispering as the truth began to eclipse Karen's shrieking lies. David stood tall, his voice steady, calm, unshaken. "Officer, I used force only to protect a vulnerable man from an illegal assault on his property. These men," he gestured to the groaning thugs in the mud, "trespassed and beat Thomas at the order of this woman." He pointed directly at Karen, who flinched like his finger was a weapon, and she stood there and encouraged it. Karen's voice cracked into hysteria. No, that's not true. They were enforcing HOA rules. He-Wash was feeding stray cats. That's a violation. We had every right." The absurdity of her words made people laugh bitterly. Mrs. Lopez yelled out, "You don't have the right to beat a man for feeding cats." Another neighbor shouted, "She fined me for putting up Christmas lights, now she's hiring thugs?" The crowd turned restless, angry, voices layering like a storm. Ramirez lifted a hand, silencing them. Then he turned to Karen, his tone flat and merciless. "Ma'am, we've had multiple complaints filed against you and your so-called HOA security. Tonight confirms every suspicion. You ordered an assault. You lied in an emergency call. You impersonated law enforcement through these men. That's criminal." He motioned to his partner. "Cuff her." Karen shrieked as the cuffs snapped around her wrists, her body twisting as she fought like a trapped animal. "No, you don't understand. I run this neighborhood. I am the authority here. You can't take me down." But her words fell on deaf ears. The thugs were dragged up one by one, limping, groaning, their weapons confiscated. David stepped aside, his arms folded, his eyes calm as if he'd known all along the outcome was inevitable. The trial became the spectacle of the decade. Reporters swarmed the courthouse. Headlines screamed about the HOA queenpin who declared war on her own neighbors. Testimony after testimony revealed her empire of intimidation, phony fines, harassment, threats of eviction, even falsified deeds. The financial records told the rest of the story. Karen had siphoned nearly $150,000 in so-called fees into her personal accounts, funneling money into vacations and jewelry while families feared foreclosure. The defense tried to paint her as misunderstood, but the jury laughed at her 911 call, where she demanded police shoot before he kills us all, played side by side with video evidence showing Thomas cowering and David defending him with surgical precision. Her lies shredded themselves in front of everyone. And then came the twist that sealed her fate. Grant, one of her former board members, turned whistleblower, testifying that Karen had conspired with a developer to seize land from elderly residents by declaring their homes non-compliant and driving them out with fines. They'd planned to sell the properties for millions. Karen turned on him mid-trial, screaming that he was the true mastermind, but emails and recorded calls revealed her voice barking orders, her arrogance dripping through every word. The verdict hit like a hammer. Guilty of fraud, conspiracy, assault, impersonation of law enforcement, and filing false emergency reports. The judge's sentence was harsher than anyone expected. 10 years in prison, full restitution, and a permanent ban from holding any leadership position. The gavel slammed, and the courtroom erupted. Neighbors wept with relief. Thomas, the simple man she had tried to crush, stood with trembling dignity and whispered, "It's over." In the weeks that followed, the HOA dissolved completely. The stolen funds were redistributed, repairs made, and for the first time in years, families lived without fear of arbitrary fines or threats. Thomas's kindness became a beacon. Neighbors helped rebuild his home, painted his porch, planted flowers in his yard. And David, though he never asked for recognition, became the quiet anchor of the community. People nodded respectfully when he passed, children waved at him, and he simply smiled, never boasting, only watching over us all like the commander he had always been. One summer night, the neighborhood gathered for a potluck under strings of lights. The air was alive with laughter, the smell of barbecue, and music played by kids with guitars. Thomas sat at the center, surrounded by friends who once had been too scared to speak up. David raised a glass quietly, not in boast, but in gratitude. To truth, he said simply, and to never letting fear rule us again. Karen had wanted power. What she left behind instead was unity. She wanted obedience. What she created was resistance. She tried to turn neighbors against one another, but she gave us a reason to stand together. And maybe that's the lesson that will outlive her tyranny, that bullies only win when silence holds sway, and that truth, defended with courage, will always roar louder than lies. So I ask you, when someone like Karen tries to weaponize fear and crush the vulnerable, what is the right thing to do? Stay quiet and hope it passes, or fight back, expose the lies, and protect those who cannot protect themselves? We fought. We won. What would you do?